The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and approaching rain. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first drops to fall. Every leaf, every blade of grass was heavy with moisture, glistening in the dim light. Twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and grey as 15-year-old Daniel ambled towards the creek, his footsteps soft on the wet ground. The colors of the sky reflected in the still water, creating a mirror image of the heavens above. The familiar path was lit by the silvery glow of the rising moon, casting long shadows that danced with the swaying branches. Daniel knew this path well. It was a place of solace and adventure for him and his brother. He was looking for his younger brother, Jimmy, who had a knack for disappearing when shadows grew long. Jimmy's adventurous spirit often led him to wander off, much to Daniel's chagrin.
Jimmy, where are you? Come on, this isn't funny.
He called out, his voice barely a whisper against the rustling leaves. The forest seemed to swallow his words, leaving him with an eerie silence. The only response was the croaking of frogs and the distant hoot of an owl. The night creatures were beginning their symphony, oblivious to Daniel's growing concern. Daniel pushed aside a tangle of branches, his heart quickening with unease. Each step felt heavier, the weight of worry pressing down on him. He spotted Jimmy crouched by the creek, his back to Daniel, his small shoulders shaking. The sight sent a jolt of fear through Daniel's chest. Relief washed over him. He wasn't hurt, but the way Jimmy's shoulders trembled told a different story.
There you are. Mom's gonna be worried sick. What are you doing out here?
His voice trailed off as he noticed the tear-streaked face of his brother. Jimmy's eyes were wide with fear, and his lips quivered as he tried to speak. This was not Jimmy's usual moping. Something was wrong. Daniel knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Hey, it's okay. What happened?" he asked gently, hoping to coax the story out of his frightened brother. Jimmy slowly opened his hand to reveal a small, mysterious object. It glinted in the moonlight, casting an eerie glow. Daniel's curiosity was piqued, but he knew that whatever it was, it had scared Jimmy deeply. The forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker. Daniel knew they needed to get back home, but first he had to understand what had frightened his brother so much. Jimmy didn't turn. He remained hunched over, his body stiff. Daniel reached out to touch his brother's shoulder, but what he saw made him recoil. His stomach lurched. It was a body, a boy, face down in the shallow water, his limbs at unnatural angles. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like it. Fear, raw and consuming, pulsed through him. He wanted to run, to scream, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, Jimmy turned. His face was ashen, eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and desperation.
Help me, we have to move him.
The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Daniel stared at his brother, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what Jimmy was suggesting. Move the body? Why? Where? He looked from Jimmy's pale face to the still figure in the creek. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but the only one that escaped his lips was a choked whisper.
Why?
Jimmy's gaze remained fixed on Daniel, his expression pleading.
Please, Danny, we can't tell anyone. Please.
His voice cracked, the facade of control crumbling, revealing the terror lurking beneath. The old grandfather clock chimed 10 times as the brothers entered their grandmother's warm kitchen, the scent of freshly baked cookies filling the air. Their grandmother, a woman whose wisdom seemed to emanate from her very being, smiled at them from her rocking chair by the fireplace.
There you two are. Where were you gallivanting?
Just exploring by the creek, Grandma.
Daniel mumbled, avoiding her gaze. His stomach churned with guilt, the weight of their secret a suffocating presence in the room. Jimmy, however, managed a weak smile.
Yeah, just catching fireflies.
His voice sounded unnaturally high, a stark contrast to his usual boisterous tone. Their grandmother's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze lingering on Jimmy for a moment too long. Years of caring for her grandsons had given her an almost uncanny ability to see through their facades.
You know, young Michael Thompson went missing this afternoon. His parents are worried sick.
Daniel froze, his blood turning to ice. He glanced at Jimmy, whose face had paled considerably. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy with unspoken words.
Did you see him by the creek?
Daniel opened his mouth to speak, to blurt out the truth, but the words caught in his throat. He stole a glance at Jimmy, who was staring at him, his eyes wide with a silent plea.
No, Grandma, we didn't see anyone.
Daniel looked away, unable to bear the weight of his brother's lie. His own silence felt like a betrayal, a confirmation of their shared guilt.
Well, I pray they find him soon, poor boy.
Later that night, as they lay in their shared bedroom, the darkness seemed to amplify the secrets that bound them. The image of the boy's lifeless face in the creek replayed in Daniel's mind, a constant reminder of their horrifying discovery. He turned to Jimmy, who lay with his back to him, his small frame shaking slightly.
We can't keep this a secret forever.
Daniel whispered, his voice tight with anxiety.
We have to, Danny. We don't have a choice.
But what if...
We'll figure it out. We just have to stick together. Promise me, Danny. Promise me you won't say anything.
Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with unsettling dreams. The kind that left Daniel feeling more exhausted than before he'd closed his eyes. Daniel tossed and turned, haunted by images of the creek, the body, and his brother's pleading eyes. The memories played on a loop, each detail more vivid and haunting than the last. He woke up several times, his heart pounding, his sheets damp with sweat. Each time he awoke, he hoped it was all just a nightmare. But the reality was far more terrifying. The weight of their secret pressed down on him, suffocating him. It was as if a heavy blanket of guilt and fear had wrapped itself around him, refusing to let go. He knew what they had done was wrong, but the thought of betraying Jimmy, of shattering their bond, filled him with a different kind of fear, the kind that gnawed at his conscience and left him questioning his own morality. He glanced at Jimmy, who was sleeping soundly for the first time that night. The sight of his brother's peaceful face brought a mix of emotions, relief, envy, and a deep-seated guilt. Daniel envied his brother's ability to find peace even in the midst of their turmoil. He longed for that same peace, but knew it would elude him as long as their secret remained buried. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity as Daniel wrestled with his thoughts and the heavy burden of their actions. The next morning, the tension between them crackled in the air. They moved about the house like ghosts, avoiding each other's eyes, the weight of their secret a tangible presence. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Daniel confronted Jimmy.
We have to tell someone. We can't just pretend this never happened.
Jimmy's face hardened, his initial fear replaced by a steely resolve that Daniel had never seen before.
And what good will that do, Danny? You think they'll believe us? We'll be branded as murderers.
But we didn't...
Does it matter? We're in this now.
The air was heavy with the smell of rain as Daniel found himself drawn back to the creek. The familiar scent brought back a flood of memories, each one more painful than the last. The sky was overcast, mirroring the turmoil within him, as if nature itself was mourning the events that had transpired. He stood on the bank, the events of the past few days replaying in his mind like a macabre film. Every detail was etched into his memory, the arguments, the accusations, the final tragic moment. He could still hear the echoes of raised voices, the sound of a life being irrevocably changed. He looked down at the water, its surface now calm and undisturbed, as if hiding the darkness that lurked beneath. The creek seemed deceptively peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded. It was as if the water held secrets, whispering them to those who dared to listen. He could almost see the boy's body lying there, could almost hear Jimmy's desperate plea. The image was seared into his mind, a haunting reminder of the price of silence. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless force that refused to be ignored. He knew what he had to do, The decision had been a long time coming, but now it was clear. He had to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The weight of his brother's secret had become too much to bear. He had to tell the truth, no matter the consequences. The fear of what might happen was overshadowed by the need for redemption. He owed it to the boy in the creek, and he owed it to himself to break free from the chains of guilt and fear that bound him to his brother's secret. He owed it to the boy in the creek, and he owed it to himself to break free from the chains of guilt and fear that bound him to his brother's secret. The truth was a beacon, guiding him out of the darkness that had enveloped his life. It was time to face the consequences and find a way to heal. Taking a deep breath, Daniel turned and walked away from the creek, the weight of his decision heavy on his heart, but a glimmer of hope flickering within him. Each step felt like a release, a shedding of the burden he'd carried for so long. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of purpose. The creek, once a place of sorrow, now symbolized a new beginning.